You see, what I said is that inaugurated eschatology shows that in some ways we're already under God's reign, even though we're not under his reign uncontested. And in some ways, we're already, as it were, transported to God's side in Christ Jesus in the heavenly realms. When God looks at me, he doesn't look at me, as it were, just Don Carson down in Chicago. He looks at me, as it were, through his son Christ. I'm secure in him. I'm as safe in him now as I ever will be 50 billion years from now. I'm identified with him. I'm secure in him. And if Christ is at the Father's right hand in glory, then in some sense Don Carson is too. So I'm not there yet in the sense that I will be when there's a new heaven and a new earth, a home of righteousness. But I'm so identified with him that if Christ is there, then I'm there too. I'm so identified with him. I'm secure. I'm at the Father's right hand too, don't you see? And engaged in this larger cosmic struggle. That's why you get a similar picture in Hebrews chapter 12 of the church already being gathered, not at Mount Sinai, but already being gathered at the New Jerusalem. This assembly of the firstborn before the throne of God. Do you see? We're already there. Whereas there in principle, there in God's mind, there in terms of what's already been achieved as we will ever be. And if instead we're still here, well, we will be there. It's already started. It's inaugurated. It's a kind of spatial equivalent. Do you see? Something to delight in, to rejoice over. Now, in particular, what does this gospel bring us then? Number one, we have been chosen and adopted. We have been chosen and adopted. Verse 4 to 6. For God chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ, in accordance with his pleasure and will, to the praise of his glorious grace. Now, I know we can get all hung up on predestination and election and things like that. Don't be too frightened of the words. After all, they're in the Bible. We should use them and try to use them the same way that the Bible writers do. At its base, the notion is not really all that difficult. Think of Abraham. There he is in Ur of the Chaldees, and he does not get up one day and say, God, seems to me that this world is going to hell in a tea basket. One judgment after another. I mean, first there was the flood, now Babel. And still there is sin and decay and corruption everywhere. I've got a suggestion. I suggest you start a whole new humanity. You could begin it with me. I'll be the granddaddy of the whole lot. You tell me what to do and I'll do it. We'll make a little covenant along those lines. And eventually my children, they'll be as numerous as the sands of the sea. We'll make a whole new humanity and show what ought to be. Is that what happens? No. God chooses Abraham. Well, how about Moses? Does Moses come along and say, I'll fix this? Well, actually, he does. He tries to do that as a young man. Manages to commit murder and then run for his life. It's only when he's 80 years old and on the backside of a desert and really feeling that life has passed him by that God chooses Moses. In exactly the same way, in the most ultimate sense, God chooses us. And he chooses us, we're told, for adoption. The adoption of sonship. Now, that needs to be explained, because when we think of adoption in the Western world, we think of adoption in terms of little babies, newly born, or occasionally a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old that's taken in as a foster child or the like. And then after a while, the foster parents decide that they'll adopt the child and so on. It's rather rare. It happens, but it's rather rare today to have let's say, a 20-year-old being adopted. But in the ancient world, adoption of adults was not uncommon. If you had, for example, a family with some significant resources, and they had no children of their own, or they had only black sheep as their children who couldn't be trusted with anything, then it was quite possible for the family legally to adopt someone whom they would like to make a son. That son would then take on the family name and have the family rights and be the family heir, and so on, so on, so on. It was bound up with the obligation then to be stamped by that family, to be owned by that family, as it were, to belong to that family, to have the rights and privileges of that family. Do you see? You may remember that that's what Abraham wanted to do with Eliezer at one point too. So God, we're told, has chosen us to be holy and blameless, predestining us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ. Sons of the living God, his children, to act like him, to behave like him, to be identified with his family, to inherit what he wants us to inherit. That's the first. Then second, we have been redeemed and forgiven, verses 7 and 8. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he lavished on us. Now, redemption today is a God talk word, isn't it? I mean, nobody in the streets of Chicago who's not a Christian is ever going to use the word redemption. But when I was a boy, people still used redemption sometimes in the secular world. It's past now. It was used in economic terms. You redeemed your mortgage. That meant you paid it off. Or if you sold your grandfather's watch in a pawn shop to get some extra money, and then you went back some weeks later to get the watch back, you had to pay the price plus a small percentage, and you redeemed the watch. So that notion of redemption was still around, but it's just about gone now. Virtually nobody in the Western world speaks of redeeming a mortgage anymore. But in the ancient world, redemption language was pretty common. It wasn't just God talk word. And it was often bound up with slavery. In the ancient world, you could become a slave because of a raiding party. You could become a slave because one side was beaten in a military tussle. But you could become a slave in the ancient world because there were no Chapter 11 or Chapter 13 bankruptcy protection laws. So if you borrow some money from some rich person, start a business, then the economy tanks, and you go bankrupt, you can't take out Chapter 11 and thus be protected while you try to pay off your debtors. The only thing you can do, the thing you had to do, legally you had to do it, was to sell yourself and perhaps your family as slaves then to the one who held your note. And that's why in the ancient world there could be slaves from any race. In American slavery, slavery was bound up with one race. But in the ancient world, you could be a Brit that was free or a Brit that was slave. You could be an Italian that was free or an Italian that was slave. You could be an African that was free or an Italian or an African that was a slave, and so on, so on, so on. Because it wasn't tied to just one race. Anybody could go bankrupt. But suppose then you become a slave because of bankruptcy laws. But you have a rich cousin 20 miles down the road. In those days, 20 miles is a full day's trip. So it's a while, because he doesn't have a cell phone, poor chap, it's a while before he hears that you've got into trouble. So some weeks later, he hears that you're in trouble, and because this cousin is not only rich, but he cares for you, he comes back and buys you out. Now, there was a whole mechanism for doing this kind of thing in the pagan temples, but what he would do was redeem you. He would set you free. He would pay the price to set you free. Do you see? He would redeem you. You would be redeemed as a slave. So in the New Testament, often we're told that God redeems us in Christ Jesus. And what he frees us from is slavery to sin. Do you recall how last week Neil Flanagan told about how sin enslaves us? The bad habits and the addictions, they keep crippling us and crippling us and crippling us until we're utterly destroyed and undone and we see no way of breaking free.